I'm just going to read through a few short excerpts from this book, Community-Based Strategic Policing in Canada by Brian Whitlaw, which was published in 2006. So just going to go through some short passages here. The rise of private security and collaborative policing. In Canada, there are now 3 times as many private security officers as there are public police. While public police services are facing cutbacks due to the attempts of governments to reduce costs, the private security industry is growing rapidly. The increase in the numbers of private security officers, often called quote-unquote rent-a-cops or robo-cops, has been precipitated by a number of factors, including the downsizing of police services, the increase in privately owned public spaces such as shopping malls, and the perception by businesses and property owners that the public police do not have the resources to serve them effectively. In addition, approximately 30% of private investigators and 25% of private security guards work for municipal, provincial, and federal government. In some venues, such as sporting events and concerts, private security officers and police officers may work together in a collaborative arrangement. Any community policing strategies developed by a police department must include plans for cooperating with private security firms and must address the suspicion with which private security firms are often viewed by police services. So it's interesting, you can tell that when they were trying to implement these things, this book was published in 2006. But when they were trying to implement these things, it does seem like there was some legitimate pushback from within the police departments. And of course, what they're saying is that these private security firms were viewed as unregulated and unaccountable. And of course, that's true because they're run by NGOs. And so those are the people who are pulling the strings. And so now that they've created this fusion between these private security firms and this collaborative community policing, this is why we're seeing more of these situations where they're targeting and harassing people who have done absolutely nothing wrong, because the source of this is coming from NGOs and people at the top. So it could be something where somebody just spoke out about something that they don't like, exposed corruption in some way. In other words, it's being used essentially as an enforcement arm to enforce totalitarianism, but they're doing it in a very sneaky and deceitful way, as they do everything. And so this book here really gives you kind of some insight into that. And this was in 2006, so they hadn't fully implemented all of this yet, but they were introducing it. And it's interesting to note that there was actually some pushback within the police. Now, a lot of the people who were against this stuff at this point are probably long gone from their positions because they probably did legitimately stand up to this and see that it was wrong and it was leading towards, you know, a slow descent into loss of basic rights and freedoms and ruination of what the police were really supposed to do, diminishing of the real duties, and all of this done through these deceitful activities presented by these unaccountable NGOs that simply come into towns and cities and impose what is essentially dictatorship, while presenting it in a manner that is deceitful, in a way that it presents the illusion that the public actually have some choice. In reality, they don't have any choice. They just impose these agendas. But sometimes they do it rather slowly and incrementally, so as to not arouse too much suspicion. Continuing on here with the passage, police unions across the country have expressed concerns about the entry of private security firms in areas that were traditionally the responsibility of the police. For police unions, private security is viewed as largely an unregulated, unaccountable industry that is guided by the private interests of corporate clients. And there you go. And so there was some real and justifiable pushback, and there were some real objections to this, but I'm sure by now they've gotten all those people who had some integrity out of the police, and they're long gone, unfortunately, because they actually had integrity and they could see what was coming with this type of thing that they've implemented. Continuing on, in spite of these concerns, private security is quickly establishing itself as a legitimate low-cost alternative to paying for the high costs of police officers. Private security is now often referred to as quote-unquote private policing. And one of the emerging issues is to sort out how a model of community-based strategic policing incorporates both public and private policing into an effective service delivery model. We will address this point in greater detail later. So again, coming back to the whole community-based system, communitarianism, and it's all centered around what is best for the community. So there's really no right or wrong, no real moral structure. It's just about how some private entity pulling the strings up above, how they dictate through these quote-unquote pillars of the community, who we discussed in previous videos, those of course being Masons within the communities, police officers, firefighters, etc. And those people would be used to determine what is in the best interest of the community. And whatever that would be, if you're not willing to go along with that, well, you're probably not going to be welcome in the community, and you're going to become a social outcast and a pariah. Regardless of how right you are, there's no focus on right or wrong. It's just what they determine is best for the community. So if they determine that criminally stalking and harassing a law-abiding citizen who's done nothing wrong is best for the community, then that's what they're going to go and expect everyone in the community to do. And there is an expectation, as per Amitai Etzione's writings, where he describes that you have a responsibility to your community. He even says you're born with a responsibility to your community. In other words, they raise their children to believe that you have to do this, and whatever they tell you, you're going to do it because it's what's best for the community. And this slow and insidious process has infiltrated not just the police, but unfortunately all public service positions in Canada. Community policing is perhaps the most significant development in Canadian policing in the past half century, and has resulted in profound changes in how police services are organized. Yeah, that's an understatement, I'd say. The traditional police organization was premised on a hierarchical paramilitary model with very distinct lines of command and control. With the advent of community policing, there has been a flattening of police organizations, caused in part by the decentralization of power and the increasing authority and autonomy being given to line officers. Moving ahead to another passage here, a partnership of public services. Community policing also provides the opportunity for partnerships between public services that traditionally have not collaborated with one another and have pursued their own organizational goals and objectives. Public service partnerships are able to develop a more integrated approach to addressing the underlying causes of crime and social disorder than the police acting alone. This is particularly true in the areas of unemployment, job training, housing, and the strengthening of social cohesion in communities. This approach is most commonly referred to as crime prevention through social development and will be considered later in the text. Many police services across the country have struggled with how to alter the organizational, administration, and delivery of policing services to incorporate the philosophy and principles of community policing. Yeah, that's because it was basically imposed upon them and there was no choice about it. But of course, they're not going to admit that, but really most of these situations where these new structured systems are brought in, they're just brought in by unaccountable NGOs. And so basically these institutions are essentially infiltrated and they have to accept moving in these directions. And those who don't like it can just leave. That's really just the way it is. And they won't be welcome in their positions anymore, and they won't be accepted. So, and that's how it has worked to get to this point where it's at now. Make no mistake about that. Ontario can be considered a leader in community policing, no question about that. We could see that for sure. Providing a supportive environment for municipal and regional police services and the Ontario Provincial Police to implement principles of community policing. And it says, let's take a brief look, and it shows the police, community policing services, provincial, community, federal, city, and then of course municipal services here as well. And here's a very important chart to look at on page 59 and table 2.2, and it says community-based strategic policing versus other policing models, and it compares the traditional policing model to the community policing model and shows you some differences, and here are some important points. So traditional administrative approaches, centralized in terms of traditional, decentralized for community policing, traditional, the authority statute, and for community policing, it's the community, and that's important there because we're seeing the difference there. Traditional policing focuses on the law, statute, rule of law. Community policing, the authority comes down to the community, which is what I've been saying with communitarianism. All it comes down to is what some outside source determines as the greater good for the community. So it doesn't matter about the laws, and it doesn't really matter about basic rights and freedoms. And that's where community policing moves us a lot more towards, provably, towards a loss of freedoms and totalitarianism. And so community role, traditional would be, traditional role for, the traditional role would be, role in the community would be report violations of the law, which is what they should be doing. The community-based approach says partnered with police to address crime, disorder, and quality of life. Okay, so the police being brought in to deal with issues that they really shouldn't be dealing with. They should be dealing with crime and violations of the law. But instead, with community policing, they're actually being brought into various aspects of people's lives. And so influence can be brought from those people to have the police deal with things that might not really have anything to do with what they should be doing with upholding the law. And then we look at operational focus. The traditional model is to deal with crime and disorder. Community policing, crime, disorder, quality of life. And here's what's important, the last one here, fear of crime and disorder. So someone reports something where nobody has committed a crime, but someone says they fear that a crime could be committed. And the police, in community policing, part of their responsibility is to deal with that. Deal with fear of crime. That's important because, again, that pushes the boundaries from real law and order and freedoms into down a slippery slope. And we see where it's led. So that's very important to look at that here. And then the final one, operational strategies. In the traditional model, it includes random patrol, reactive investigation, and rapid response, the 3 R's. In community policing, it has targeted patrol, partnerships, problem solving, proactive or preventative policing, and geographic-based deployment of personnel. So these are significant differences, and it's important to look at this because it shows you the contrast between traditional policing and community policing, and we see how negatively this has, the negative results that this has brought about, in my opinion. And there's another chart here which also provides another comparison between traditional policing and community policing. And it's interesting to note the significant and important differences. So under traditional policing, the question is, who are the police? A government agency principally responsible for law enforcement. Under community policing, police are the public and the public are the police. So the community, the public, incorporated also into being the police and doing police work. Police officers are those who are paid to give full-time attention to the duties of every citizen. And then question 2, what is the relationship between the police and other public service departments? Under traditional policing, their priorities often conflict. Under community policing, the police are only one department among many responsible for improving the quality of life. So again, we see the onus being taken off the police with regards to actually an onus on law enforcement and moving them into duties such as improving the quality of life. And question 3, what is the role of the police? Under traditional policing, to solve crimes. Under community policing, to take a broader problem-solving approach. Okay, so under number 6 here, it says, what specifically do police deal with? Under traditional policing, incidents. Under community policing, citizens' problems and concerns. So if a citizen says, I have a neighbor who I don't like, etc., something like that, we have to do what's best for the community. Maybe the police should watch that person, right? Forget about the basic human rights of that person and whether they've actually done anything wrong. We just say we have to watch that person because this person doesn't like them. And because some Freemason in the community, some pillar of the community, says that they want to have that person watched, even though there's no valid reason for doing so, or the reason is simply contrived. So again, that's very disturbing, and you see the distinct differences between traditional policing and community policing there. Very glaring. So just a basic summary. Those are just some short passages from the book, but as you can tell, it gives you a clear view into what they have done in terms of really drastically changing the responsibilities of the police in recent years. And we see what it has come to. We see that rule of law and upholding the law are no longer the sole focus of their responsibilities. And we can kind of understand why we see these things happening, although it is very disturbing to see these things happening. But one thing to note is that it does tell you that there were a lot of objections to these things within the police when they first started to implement them. So there was pushback, but at this point it's clear that all of those people who had integrity and pushed back against these things are no longer in their positions, and that's disturbing as well. And looking at this is just scratching the surface in terms of the things that have come about as a result of what these NGOs have literally imposed upon communities leading up to this communitarian system. Rule of law has fallen by the wayside, and outside sources are determining what is best for the community. And those outside sources, a lot of them will be used to influence the people who they will go to try and push these agendas within the communities. And so this is when you read this literature, you kind of understand how a lot of this has come to be. And but this is just specifically with regards to community policing, and it falls right in line with all of the other things that are leading down to the slippery slope to totalitarianism within the Canadian communitarian system.